Welcome to Guide Mia. Today we're going to talk about case statuses, every status a Cympha case can be in, what each one means, and who's supposed to be holding the case at that moment. This is a reference lecture rather than a step-by-step. We're going to walk the whole ladder in order, one status at a time, from a draft on a clinician's screen all the way to a finished, archived case. It's for anyone who looks at a case. Statuses appear on the case list, the case detail page, the queue, and every email, and knowing what each one means saves a lot of guessing. For each status I'll give you the same 4 things the written glossary gives you: what it means in plain English, who holds the case at that point, what action moves it forward, and roughly how long it should sit there. By the end, when a case says awaiting approval or escalated, you'll know exactly who the ball is with and what happens next. Listen straight through once, and keep the written glossary open as your everyday lookup. First, the shape of the system. A case moves between statuses as work progresses, and there are 16 of them in total. The lab ladder we'll spend most of our time on, plus clinical, the resting state for doctor-managed cases. Every status has an expected role, who should be holding the case at that point. And that expected role isn't decoration, it gates assignment. If a case is designing, Cympha will only let it sit with a designer class user, meaning a designer or an AlignerBot seat. Every status also has a set of allowed transitions out. You can't move a case anywhere you like, only where the ladder permits. Some of those transitions are user-driven, the clinician approves, the lab manager assigns. Others are automatic, assigning a designer flips the case to designing by itself, and an approval auto-advances the case to its next stage. Hold on to those 2 ideas, expected role, and user-driven versus automatic, because every status we visit is just those 2 ideas with a name on it. The tour starts before the lab is involved at all, with a status most people never consciously notice: draft. The moment a clinician opens the new case form, Cympha quietly reserves a real case row in the background. Why? So that file uploads have somewhere real to attach from the very first second, before the clinician has filled in a single field of the form. It's a technicality, but a useful one to understand, because it means the scans a doctor drags in are never floating in limbo waiting for a form to be finished. The clinician holds a draft, it's entirely customer side. And there are exactly 2 ways out of it. Pressing Submit Case flips the draft to submitted. Canceling the new case form discards the draft altogether. Duration should be minutes. A case that sits in draft overnight isn't really a case, it means somebody abandoned a new case tab, and nothing is waiting on the lab. Clinical is a different creature entirely, and it's the one status on our list that never enters the lab ladder at all. It's the resting state for a doctor-managed clinical case, a case with no lab on the other end, no approval cycle, and no pricing attached. Consultations, in-practice records, ongoing patient photo uploads, that's the shape of work that lives here, and the clinician holds it throughout. A clinical case sits on clinical for its entire life. Notice what that implies: there are no transitions out on the standard ladder. Nothing pushes a clinical case forward, because there's nowhere forward for it to go. When the doctor decides the treatment needs lab work, they don't convert this case, they branch it, creating a new sibling lab case that starts at submitted like every other case in Cympha. The clinical case stays exactly where it was, still clinical, still holding the patient's story. Duration is open-ended, as long as the clinician keeps the record. Now the case reaches the lab, and the ladder proper begins. Submitted means exactly what it says: the case has been sent to the lab and is awaiting triage. It's the first thing a lab manager sees on the queue every morning, and the lab manager is the holder, not a designer, not the person who'll eventually do the work. Triage is a decision, and it belongs to one desk. There are 3 ways out. The lab manager can assign a case intaker, which sends the case to intake review. They can assign a designer or an AlignerBot seat, which sends it straight to designing. Or they can cancel it. Typical duration is hours. This is meant to be a short stop. And here's the diagnostic worth remembering: a submitted case older than a working day usually means the lab is overloaded. If you manage a lab and your submitted column is growing, that's your capacity signal, and it shows up here before it shows up anywhere else. Intake review is the quality gate that sits before design. A case intaker is reviewing the submission's data quality: are the scans clean, is the CBCT readable, is the prescription clear enough to work from. The point is to catch a bad submission before a designer spends half a day discovering it themselves. The intaker holds the case, and typical duration is hours. 2 ways out. If the submission is good, the intaker forwards it to a designer and the case moves to designing. If something is missing, they push it back toward the customer for more files, which sends the case to awaiting customer info. And here's the detail that surprises people the first time they see it. If the lab has nobody in the case intaker role, this step is skipped entirely. Submitted cases go straight to designing. That's by design, not a gap. Not every lab wants an intake step, and the latter simply shortens itself to match the team you actually have. Designing is the status where the actual work happens. A designer, human, or an AlignerBot seat, automated, is actively building the design. The holder is whoever is doing that work, and remember the expected role gates it. Cympha will only let a designing case sit with a designer class user. There are two ways out. The normal one, the designer finishes a deliverable and clicks request approval, which sends the case to awaiting approval for the clinician to review. The other, the designer discovers something is missing, a scan, a file, an answer, and flags it, which moves the case to awaiting customer info. How long a case sits here varies more than at any other status. An automated aligner plan, phase 1, takes hours. Human design work takes days, depending on how complex the case is. If you manage a lab, designing is the status you'll watch most closely, because it's where your capacity actually lives. Awaiting approval is the ladder's hinge. A deliverable is ready, and the customer, the clinician, has been asked to review it on the case's approval page. The case is in their hands now, not the lab's, and that's the single most important thing to read off this status. It always carries an approval step label telling you which milestone is under review: plan approval pending, appliance approval pending, or design approval pending. We'll unpack those labels properly at the end of the tour. The clinician has 3 buttons, and each maps to a status. Approved design sends the case to approved. Request changes sends it to customer rejected. And escalate to lab manager sends it to escalated. One expectation to set, especially if you're lab side, this is typically the slowest stage on any case, not because anything is wrong, but because chairs are busy and reviews wait for the clinician's next free moment. Days here are normal. Awaiting customer info is the waiting room. A lab-side worker, a designer, an intaker, or the manager, is blocked, waiting for additional files or an answer from the doctor. The subtle part is what this status does not do. Flipping it doesn't move the case to anybody. By design, the status is decoupled from holder reassignment. It's a label that means waiting, and the current holder keeps the case. If the lab actually wants to push the case into the customer's hands, that's a separate, explicit handoff to customer action. The decoupling is deliberate. Very often the designer wants to keep the case on their own bench while a question is outstanding, rather than lose it into somebody else's queue. When the customer replies, the case typically returns to whoever raised the question, and the work resumes where it stopped. Duration is as variable as awaiting approval, and for exactly the same reason, it's waiting on chairside time. Not every review ends in a yes, and 2 statuses cover what happens then. The first is customer rejected. It means the clinician looked at the deliverable on the approval page and pressed request changes. The case bounces back to the lab worker who actually built that deliverable, and note how Cympha finds them. It walks the case's event history backwards to identify the previous lab worker. So the rejection lands on the right bench, with the person who has the file open and the context in their head, rather than on whoever happens to be free. From there the path is the ordinary one. That worker reworks the design, the case returns to designing, and it comes back through awaiting approval on the next request for sign-off. Typical duration is hours to a day. And a note on tone, a rejection here is not a complaint. It's the normal shape of a design conversation, written down where everyone can see it. Escalated is the second of the two, and it's different in kind. The clinician pressed escalate to lab manager on the approval page, which says something quite specific. They want a more senior review than the previous handler gave them. So this status doesn't route by history, it routes explicitly to the lab manager, every time. From there the manager has 3 options: reroute the case to a different designer, intervene personally and handle it themselves, or push it back to the original worker with direction. Typical duration is hours. Escalations are meant to be unblocked quickly, because a clinician who escalated is a clinician who is already waiting. Put the 2 together and the distinction is easy to hold. Customer rejected says fix this. Escalated says I'd like a senior pair of eyes. Both are normal parts of the conversation between a clinic and a lab, not alarms. Approved sounds like an ending, but it's really a pivot, and it behaves completely differently for digital and physical work. First, what's always true: the clinician has signed off on the current approval step, and the matching label flips from X pending to X approved. The holder is the lab worker who just got that approval, the designer, the AlignerBot seat, or the manufacturing engineer. Now the fork. On digital categories, ortho, aligner, and implant, the case auto-advances immediately. If that was the plan approval, the case goes straight back to designing for the appliance cycle. If it was the final approval, it goes to delivered digital, because a digital deliverable has no manufacturing step at all. On those cases approved last seconds, if you catch a case sitting there, you've caught it mid-pivot. Physical cases, the lab service category, do the opposite. They stop at approved and wait for the lab to move them into manufacturing manually. That pause is intentional. It means the lab controls its own production schedule, rather than an approval on a Friday evening starting a print run by itself. Now the physical track, which exists only for things that actually get made. In manufacturing means a physical case is being fabricated, printed, milled, finished, whatever the deliverable requires. The expected role is the manufacturing engineer, and they hold the case for as long as the work takes. There's one way out: when the piece is made and packed, the engineer marks the case as shipped, which moves it to shipping. Typical duration is days, and it varies with what's being produced. Two things follow from this. First, a lab with no manufacturing engineer never sees this status, and that's fine. A purely digital lab has no use for it. Second, if you're a clinician wondering why a physical case has been quiet for a few days, this is usually the answer, and it's the one stage where the delay is a physical process rather than someone's inbox. Shipping means the deliverable is in transit, it has left the lab and is on its way to the practice. The expected role here is either the lab manager or an operational user, the people who deal with couriers, packing slips, and tracking numbers. Notice that this is one of the few statuses with two acceptable holders, which reflects how labs actually work. In a small lab the manager posts the parcel, in a larger one there's a shipping desk. The way out is customer receipt. When the practice receives the package, the case moves to delivered physical. Typical duration is days, and it's courier dependent, which is a polite way of saying it's the one stretch of the ladder nobody in the workflow controls. Again, a digital case never touches this status. If your lab does purely digital work, you may simply never see in manufacturing or shipping at all. Here's a distinction Cympha draws that many systems don't: delivered is not the same as done. Delivered digital means a digital deliverable, a review file, a package, a printable file, has reached the customer. And at that point the case is deliberately not archived. The holder is preserved, the designer, or whoever last held the case, keeps it on their bench. Why? Because delivery is exactly when follow-ups happen. The customer asks for more aligner models, or an updated plan, or has a manufacturing question, and the person who did the work should still have the case in hand to answer, rather than fishing it out of an archive. Cases legitimately sit at delivered digital for weeks while a patient's treatment plays out, and that is not a stalled case. The only way forward is the explicit mark as finished action. Nothing here times out, and nothing advances on its own. Delivered physical is the same idea, arriving down the other track. A physical deliverable reached the customer, and the case rests there. The holder is preserved for exactly the reason we just covered. The follow-up question about the thing you made is far more likely to come after it lands on the doctor's desk than before. And like its digital twin, the only transition out is the explicit mark as finished action. So both delivered statuses behave identically once you're in them. The only difference is which track brought the case there, the manufacturing and shipping route, or the straight digital handoff. If you're scanning a queue, treat both the same way. These are cases that succeeded and are simply waiting for someone to say the conversation is over. And the latter ends at two terminal statuses. The first is finished. It means the case is archived, no holder, no further activity expected, nothing anybody is waiting on. You reach it exactly one way, an explicit mark as finished action by the lab manager. There's no timeout, no nightly job that sweeps old cases away, no auto-archive after 30 days. A human decides the case is done, and that decision is recorded. Once there, finished is terminal in the strict sense. There are no transitions out of it, and an administrator override is the only way back. Duration is permanent. That strictness is what makes the rest of the ladder trustworthy. When you filter your queue to exclude finished cases, you know nothing is quietly crawling back out of the archive behind you. Cancelled is the other ending, and the one nobody plans for. It means the case was cancelled before completing, the patient didn't proceed, the submission was a duplicate, the treatment changed direction. The holder is cleared, because nobody owns a cancelled case, there's no work waiting on anyone. Like finished, it's terminal, no transitions out, and permanent. The pair of them is worth thinking of together. Every case in Cympha eventually lands on one of these two, it either finished, or it was cancelled, and both are dead ends by design. That's 16 statuses, and you've now walked all of them, 2 before the lab, 2 at the door, the design and approval loop in the middle, the physical track for things that get made, 2 delivered states that stay open, and 2 endings. One last piece ties the tour together, the approval step labels. Awaiting approval and approved both ride alongside a label, because the same status can mean 2 different things on the same case. Is the clinician approving the treatment plan, or the finished appliance? Without the label you couldn't tell. There are 3 values. Plan is the first review milestone, used by ortho, aligner, and implant cases. Appliance is the second milestone for those same 3 categories, the appliance, or the final design. And design is the single review step used by lab service cases. Custom services get 1 approval cycle, not 2. So each category has a fixed sequence, ortho, aligner, and implant cases run plan, then appliance, 2 full approval cycles through the ladder, while lab service cases run design once. Which means when you read a status line like awaiting approval, appliance approval pending, you now know exactly where in the case's life you're standing. Second cycle, clinician's court. So that's the whole ladder, walked once, status by status, draft and clinical before the lab, submitted and intake review at the door, designing and the approval loop in the middle, the rejection and escalation paths when a review pushes back, the physical track for things that get made, the delivered states that stay open for follow-ups, and 2 terminal endings that nothing crawls back out of. The written glossary carries all of it as a quick reference table, 1 row per status, with the holder, the way out, and the typical duration, and that table is the thing to keep open beside your queue. But the skill you've actually built today is simpler than the table. For any status on any case, you can now answer whose move is it, the lab's, the clinician's, or nobody's. That one question resolves almost every where's my case conversation before it starts. The written glossary, including a quick reference table you'll want to keep open next to your queue, is at cympha.com under Docs, titled Case Status Glossary. This series is walking through every Cympha workflow, 1 lecture at a time, and the role matrix lecture is this one's natural companion. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.